Thank you for joining the Lakeside Light Podcast. It's light to help you see your way, and a light version of our full televised Sunday services, which you can find on our website at lakesidechurch.org. This audio podcast is a weekly sermon message of intellectual, spiritual, and sometimes humorous nourishment for the road. Enjoy.
So, Paul has this ongoing torment in his life, some kind of bitter burden or daily struggle. He calls it the thorn in his flesh. We don't know what it was. It must have been bad. That word thorn in Greek can also be translated a sharpened stake, the kind of thing you'd put in the bottom of a pit in hopes of impaling a wild animal or attacking soldiers. What we do know is that Paul prays repeatedly that God will pluck this thorn. But God doesn't do so. In fact, the risen Lord says to Paul that he intends to leave that thorn in place, embedded in Paul's life. Now, we read this passage, and I think for many of us, Paul's plight hits us close to home. It can call to mind our own struggles and burdens. Paul's story forces the question on us, how do we make sense, as Christians, how do we make sense of the thorny parts of life? The setbacks we really don't deserve. The struggles that just seem to go on and on and on. Now, I'm not going to insult you with neat, pat answers to those questions this morning. I'd rather have a kind of open-ended conversation. And yes, I realize in this conversation I get to do all the talking. But I hope that I won't have the last word. I hope that you will continue the conversation with yourself or in your prayers or with someone you trust. Or maybe you'll meet me in my Panera office and tell me what you think. But for now, let me offer a few reflections. I want to say up front that sometimes, at least, hard things are good for us. In any particular moment of suffering, we can at least consider that there might be something in this that could teach us or strengthen us or guide us. When I was in seminary, my fiance dumped me. I'd like to say that with more decorum, but it was a dumping. It was a dumping. And when she gave me back the engagement ring, I mean, that was the one bright spot. When she gave me back the engagement ring, I was heartbroken. I felt like the bottom had just fallen out. But without belaboring this, I can say with conviction and thankfulness that painful dumping saved me from years of struggle and opened the way for me to find the great love of my life. Now, I'm not saying that we will find a silver lining in every grief and loss. I'm not saying that. Frankly, some events in life are so terrible that no blessing can possibly balance the scales. But I am saying that when things go wrong, we can at least keep ourselves open to whatever God might be up to in that hard place, in that thorny place. Now, another thought occurs to me as I read Paul's very honest accounts of his own struggle. Whenever we face a problem that we cannot manage on our own, we are reminded that we are not our own saviors. You know, somewhere inside us, we have this notion that if we just keep trying, if we just work hard enough, we can overcome every challenge. When I was in seminary, I served a little country church outside of Louisville. a church filled with farmers and laborers, and I was visiting an elderly lady one day in her home, and I was ending the visit, and I reached out and took her hand to pray. But before I could start praying, she turned my hand over and looked at it and said, "You don't do much work, do you?" Ironically, at the time, I was carrying a full load in seminary, doing regular all-nighters to get papers finished, working a part-time job during the week, and spending weekends 50 miles away doing pastoral visits and teaching Sunday school and preaching. And I'm telling you this because even 45 years later, I still need to prove that I'm not a slacker. You know, most of us are like Paul. We want people to know how hard we work. In this passage, I love it. Paul says, I'm not going to boast. I'm not going to talk about the vision of heaven I had. I'm not going to talk about the depths of my prayer life. A few verses earlier, he says, I'm not going to talk about how many times in the service of Jesus I've been shipwrecked and whipped and beaten and stoned. Far be it from me to bring that up. We're like Paul. We've worked hard, and we want people to know that we've worked hard. But friends, our work will not save us. Our best efforts will not save us from illness or loneliness or plane crashes or dementia or addiction. When pain comes, pain we cannot overcome, a thorn we cannot pluck on our own, we are reminded once again that our hope cannot be in ourselves. Our hope must be in our Savior. And whatever the thorn in your flesh or your heart or your thoughts, we are all broken people. And we cannot fix ourselves. That's part of what we learn from the thorn. Now, fortunately, God can and does use broken people. I was telling the midweek Bible study, and I think they enjoyed this, about a fellow named David Ring. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's about my age now, and had a rough childhood, an orphan, was passed around, and contracted cerebral palsy at a young age. Nonetheless, despite the pain of that and the scorn he encountered and speech impediments, he became a preacher and a motivational speaker. He loves to begin by standing in front of a group of people, whether it's a speech or a sermon, standing in front, surveying the crowd and saying, "Hi, I'm David Ring. I have cerebral palsy. What's your problem?" Exactly. It's easy to write ourselves off, isn't it? I mean, whatever the problem is, whether it's family scars or anxiety or disability or anger, it's tempting to devalue ourselves. What good am I? What good can I do? What difference can I make? As a teenager, I knew two things. I knew that I was called to pastoral ministry, and I knew what kind of minister I wanted to be. I wanted to be the kind of minister who could meet somebody once and recall their name 5 years later when I shook them by the hand. Turns out I'm the kind of minister, if I can make it the 5 minutes between the back door and the fellowship hall, I'm really cooking. I wanted to be the CEO type of pastor at the helm of the church, analyzing and organizing and long-range planning. In fact, I've never met a financial statement or a flow chart that made sense to me. And I have rarely planned further than lunchtime. I wanted to be a great pulpiteer, handing down wisdom in a rich, reverberating orator's voice. In fact, I have an ordinary voice, a folksy delivery, and after the sermon at the back door, when people want to be kind, nobody ever says, "Mike, you're so wise." They take my hand, they say, "Gee, you're funny." The ministry thing would have been so frustrating, except I finally realized that despite all the things I don't have, despite all the things I can't do, God is using the things I do have. God is calling me to be me, just as God was calling Paul to be Paul, and just as God is calling you to be you. Not somebody else. God is calling you to be you in the service of Jesus. Never mind our shortcomings, never mind our broken places. Now, the risen Christ says two things to Paul. He says, my power is made perfect in your weakness. Now, admitting our weakness, that's the last thing we want to do, right? Personally, I'd rather put on my game face. Everything's fine. No problemo. I got this. Except sometimes we don't got this. And that's where Jesus turns things upside down if we let him. Because when we are at our lowest ebb, the power of Christ is made perfect in our weakness. When we are spent and overwhelmed, the power of Christ is made perfect in our weakness. When our failure is staring us in the face and we know we are in a losing fight, the power of Christ is made perfect in our weakness. The world says you got to be strong. Jesus says, when you are weak, it leaves me some room to work, Mike. Now, when we hear that word perfect, I know that we think flawless or unblemished. But the Greek word really means completeness or fullness or fulfillment. Our weakness makes room for the power of Christ to come in fullness. Our weakness makes room for the power of Christ to fulfill us. If there's a hole in my life or yours, that is the very place where Christ is likely to be at work. My power is made full in your weakness. The other thing Jesus says is, my grace is sufficient for you. My grace is enough to see you through. My grace is all you really and finally need. Lately, I've found a new way of thinking about grace. Have you ever heard of kintsugi? Anybody? It's making the rounds. It's out there now. Kintsugi is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery. Not in a way that hides the cracks, but in a way that accentuates the broken places. The broken places are sealed with liquid gold or liquid silver to create a different kind of beauty than the original. And lately, this is the way I've been thinking about grace as sort of God's kintsugi. Maybe some people make it through this world without a chip or a crack or a break. Maybe. But I doubt it. I doubt it. Grace is God's kintsugi, the divine hand that mends us and heals us and even evokes beauty in the brokenness where we thought there could only be despair. In essence, what Jesus says to Paul is, I know you don't have everything you want, Paul, but you do have me. Life may withhold from us something we desperately want. Life may afflict us with something we really don't want. But when the thorn digs deep, can we believe that Christ is with us nonetheless? That Christ is giving himself to us right there in that place where it hurts the most. My grace is enough for you. Can we hang on to that promise in the thick of the struggle? In the deepest, darkest valley? Can we cling to that promise even when our props have failed and the ground opens underneath us? Can we believe that Christ really walks with us through fire and flood, through grief and disappointment? And maybe more to the point, maybe the real point here, if we can believe that, is it enough? Is it enough? Is Christ enough to see us through, enough to sustain us, enough to make our peace? Is His grace really sufficient? I promised an open-ended conversation this morning, so I leave the questions hanging. Because the only answer that can make a difference is the answer you find for yourself. The answer revealed on the holy ground, on the thorny ground, where your faith confronts your struggles. Let me know what you figure out. To God alone be the glory. Amen.
The Lakeside Light Podcast is a copyrighted production of Lakeside Presbyterian Church. Visit our website at lakesidechurch.org for more information. Have a great week.